All right, so today we are going to talk about primary lesson preparation. So all of you are going to be teaching either first or second grade math in a few weeks. And last semester we made a general elementary math lesson. Now we need to prepare a primary math lesson. So today I want to talk about preparing a primary math lesson. First of all, I want to talk about contrasting teaching style in primary versus, I'm talking about the teacher, and the teaching style in primary versus elementary versus intermediate or upper elementary. So primary elementary grades, basically 1, 2, and a little bit of 3, versus elementary, which is 3, 4, 5-ish, versus intermediate or upper, which is 6, 7, 8. What is the difference in teaching style? Because you have to understand the difference in teaching style before you can start your lesson preparation. What is the difference between how Miss Mayville teaches second grade versus how I teach 7th grade, which of course is a big difference, but also in the middle versus how Mrs. Haiti teaches 3rd grade math or teaches 4th grade math. I think she's teaching 3rd grade math this year, but she has taught 4th grade math. So have I. Okay, but what's the difference in teaching style? What is the theme in primary math this semester?
From scratch.
From scratch. Did I tell you what the theme is in intermediate?
Building blocks.
Tools in the toolbox. And what did I say? What did we say in primary? We have said that you're not just building the foundation, you're digging the foundation and building it. And so then the elementary teacher already has the foundation. The intermediate teacher has even more of the foundation already poured. Hopefully by intermediate, a lot of it's poured, it's solidified, and we've already started building up, framing the house, okay? So you have to kind of keep that in mind. So at primary level, we are digging the foundation and pouring it, okay? At elementary level, the foundation needs to already be there, and we're going to start framing the house. But by upper elementary, or what I'm calling intermediate level, we are putting up the siding and putting in the windows and things like that. So we have to approach our teaching style differently, and that involves preparing differently. All right, I know you probably have got this from me already, but which one do I think is the hardest to teach? Primary, because you have to teach from scratch. Okay, you might think, oh, primary is easy because I can do that math. I can't do the math that those 7th graders are doing. I'm not good at fractions, or I'm not good at decimals, or I've always missed the metric system. No, that's not going to be the approach here. The approach here is that you're going to be teaching from scratch. So there's a difference in teaching style. So I'm going to go back to that teaching from scratch. What does it mean? Think about your 7 steps. What does it mean when we're talking about teaching from scratch? First and foremost, you have to watch your vocabulary. You have to watch your vocabulary. That's the first thing. So we're thinking about teaching style at primary versus the other two. Teaching style in primary, first of all, you have to watch your vocabulary. We've talked about this and talked about this. There are 2 reasons. First of all, they have no math vocabulary. You are starting from the beginning. You have to build the math vocabulary from the very beginning, like we've been saying, from scratch, okay? It's not part of basic English for a 1st grader. It's not part of their vocabulary. So you're starting their math vocabulary from the beginning. That's the first idea. Watch your vocabulary because you're starting their vocabulary from the very beginning. The second thing, as far as watching your vocabulary, is the idea is your students take you very, what? Literally. So you have to watch your vocabulary. First of all, They don't have a math vocabulary. You have to you have to give them the terms. You have to give them the terminology. But then you have to watch everything you say because they will take you literally. All right, so you have to lower the level of your language. So as a primary teacher, watch your vocabulary. Elementary teacher, you still have to watch your vocabulary, but you already have words from which you can build. They don't take you as literally because they're used to being in the classroom and they're already used to doing math. Now in intermediate, you still watch your vocabulary, but you don't have the danger of them not understanding you. Okay, now I have to watch my vocabulary in 7th grade math because they don't have a good math vocabulary. I've told you before, the joke is, do you speak English? We're having trouble in geometry, knowing the difference between classifying and naming. Okay, in their book, classifying an angle means calling it as what type? Acute, obtuse, right, or straight. Naming the angle was actually giving its particular name, angle ABC, okay? And a lot of them just kept doing acute, obtuse. Well, yes, that's an acute angle, that's the type of angle, it's not the name of the angle. So even in intermediate, we're still conscious of our vocabulary and that we're on the same page with our terminology as the students are. So I'm not saying that in primary you have to watch your vocabulary and in intermediate you don't. It's just a whole lot more intense and more important at primary level. Okay, we still have to, it's called the law of language, and it doesn't just apply to primary, but you have to be especially careful of what words you use and how you use them. So first of all, primary teachers have to watch their vocabulary. Second thing, primary teachers have to know their students. You have to watch your vocabulary and know your students. I am not saying that I don't need to know my students' strengths and weaknesses and problem areas in 7th grade, but it's a little bit more important and a little bit more basic teaching in primary, so you have to know your students. First of all, you need to understand their maturity level, whether individually or collectively. You have to understand their maturity level, whether individually or collectively. This was my problem in 2nd grade math. I didn't understand what they could and could not do. Okay, so there's two ideas here. You have to understand their maturity level and you have to understand their ability, their math level, their maturity level and their math level. I was getting ahead of myself and explaining math level first. So as a primary teacher, you have to especially watch your vocabulary. As the primary teacher, you have to know your students even more thoroughly than upper level teachers. You have to understand their maturity level and their math level. As far as maturity level goes, you have to understand that they are not used to independent work. They cannot work on their own nearly as much as 3rd graders and 4th graders, and up the ladder we go. So as a teacher, you have to prepare for the fact that you have to do a lot more supervision. You have to give a lot more instruction. You can't just tell them to do something. And you also have to be creative in involving every person. I, as a 7th grade teacher, do not have to be creative. I don't. I can keep everybody busy by telling them to all work the problem. Can I do that to 1st graders? Okay, Johnny's at the board, he's doing our subtraction problem, everybody do it at their seats. Not happening in 1st grade. So you have to understand their maturity level, that they are not independent workers, or they're limited independent workers. So that means when you are preparing your math lesson, what am I talking about? You have to be prepared to have specific instructions on every little detail. I think this is especially true for when you're teaching 1st grade at the beginning of the year. What do I do in 7th grade math when I assign homework? I put it on the board. And the students know they need to write it down and they need to do the correct assignment. Though sometimes in 7th grade math, I have to point it out and I'll tell them, get your planners out, make sure you have your homework down. Because I have to understand that 7th graders aren't 9th graders. But for sure, 1st graders are not independent workers. They're immature. You can't just put the homework on the board unless you train them. So you have to watch your language and you have to know your students. You have to know your students' maturity level. You have to be aware that they're not independent workers. They need detailed instructions. And you have to plan this. When you teach for Miss Mayville or Mrs. Brader, you'll have to say, pencils down. You'll have to say, fold your hands. You'll have to say, pick up your pencil. You'll have to say, put your name on your paper. Do you understand the difference? So you have to understand your maturity, the maturity level. You have to remember they're not independent workers. They require specific instructions and you have to guide them. They require you to keep them busy. So class participation is a problem in primary. And so you have to be creative. You have to keep things moving. So all of these things are have to be in your mindset before you even get your lesson to prepare to teach. So you have to understand their maturity level, then you have to understand their math level. This is where I was starting to say you have to know what they can and cannot do. And we've said this before, I've mentioned it with different topics, here it is again. You cannot assume they know anything. And actually that's more of a fault of older teachers because, hey, you're in 7th grade. What do you mean you don't know what 8 times 7 is? Okay? But that's still true in 1st grade. You can't assume they know their place value. You can't assume that they know anything, and that's even true at 1st grade. It still can be a problem for a primary teacher assuming too much. It's a bigger problem for an intermediate teacher assuming too much, but that doesn't mean you have to know that. You have to understand their maturity level. You have to understand their math level. Also with their math level, yes, you have to understand what they can and cannot do, but you also have to understand with their math skills, you have to understand what they do and do not understand. Okay, so what they can and cannot do, what they do and do not understand. You have to understand their math ability. All right, and you also have to understand their, I'm going to use the word, instead of basic, I'm going to use the word foundational skills. All right, I just told you to tell them to put their name on their paper. What do you have to do? You have to tell them to do it, and you have to wait for them to do it. It's going to take them a lot longer to write things down. It's going to take them a lot more time to write their name. You're going to have to tell them where to put their name. It might say name, big blank, but okay, you're going to have to really know what they can and cannot do, both with their math skills, with their understanding, even back to their vocabulary. So you have to understand your students even more. You have to understand their maturity level and their math level. The last thing that you have to understand is students' problem areas. The maturity level, their math skill level, and even their problem areas. Strength, maybe we say strengths and weaknesses. And this is both in the idea of as a person and as a learner. What are their problem areas as a person or a learner? Okay, it's going to be a lot more obvious in 1st grade who has trouble paying attention, who has trouble bringing their math book to class and having their math page with them, or whatever you're doing. So you have to consider that. You have to make sure they have their math book. You have to make sure they have their math page, or whatever your procedure is. So then you have to understand your students, their maturity level, their math level, and even their problem areas, their strengths and weaknesses. First of all, as a person or as a learner. Which students have trouble paying attention? Which students have trouble sitting still? Which students are visual learners and audio learners? And so that's why we're bringing in all of these things. And you've heard, even in the children's ministry seminar, and I know you've heard before, that you remember a low percent of what you hear, a higher percent of what you hear and see, a higher percent of what you actually see, do, and touch, or whatever, different levels. Remember, Brother Thomas said you remember, what, 10% of what you hear? That's pretty low. And so do you want your first graders remembering 10% of the lesson? So that means you have to do a lot more than do. You also have to do a lot more than just see. You have to practice and practice and practice. You have to use the manipulatives and so forth. So to me, the primary math lesson is a lot more intense for the teacher. Okay? I told you before when I taught that second grade math class, I had the misconception, I taught it the last class of the day. Okay, I went from 7th grade math to 9th grade algebra 1. And then at 2 o'clock, I came down and taught 2nd grade math. I thought I could just come in, teach the lesson, no problem. Boy, was I wrong. I was having to spend more time prepping my 2nd grade math class, definitely more than the algebra class. I taught it quite a bit, more than the 7th grade math class, more than my college classes. Because the preparation, I had to think through and I had to understand all these things about students. I didn't really understand them on a personal level. Okay, so you have to understand them as a learner and as a person. Okay, you have to understand how do they learn, where are they at, as far as even sitting still, paying attention, and so forth. Like I told you, I was coming from 9th grade down to 2nd grade. The 9th graders, we do a lot of board work. Everybody's working all the problems. I have no trouble with class participation. They're pretty much self-motivated. They know if they don't figure this out in class, they're going to be struggling with their homework. And so they're very engaged in watching me do the problem. They're engaged in going up to the board and trying to work it out for themselves, at least most of them, not all of them. I don't have to pay attention to what they're doing in my class. Sometimes I have to watch behavior, even in high school, but not nearly to the extent of 1st grade. Okay, and I also didn't understand them at a personal level. In 9th grade, do they want to ask me questions? Do they have their hands up all the time? Not at all. Some of them do. When I ask direct questions, they raise their hand and so forth. But what happens when I walk into the 2nd grade classroom at 2 o'clock each afternoon when the students see me for the first time that day? What happens? They want to talk to me. High school students don't want to talk to me, per se, do they? Now the junior high somewhat, they do. And some of them, by personality, they see me and they come in and they want to talk to me. But I didn't get barraged with students wanting me to tell me about what they had for lunch and what their dog's name is and where they're going on vacation and all kinds of stuff. And I was totally not used to that interaction because it doesn't take place in high school. So you have to understand things like that. I also, the students, the elementary students were a lot better at playing me than the high school students were. High school students, they go up to the board, they do not want to make a mistake in front of all their peers. They don't like going up to the board. They'd rather just sit in the back and do it on their own paper and stay below the radar. Well, 1st and 2nd graders, they like being on the radar. They want the teacher's attention. I had a couple 2nd graders making mistakes. I was teaching borrowing. They'd make a mistake on purpose or pretend not to understand on purpose so that Mrs. Wright would walk over to them and show them personally how to borrow. I had a couple people doing that. couple of them you know. All right, and the teacher, the first and second grade main teacher, I was talking to her, and I had her come in and observe me a few times because I didn't know how to teach second grade math, okay? And she said, after observing me, she said, "Did you see what so-and-so was doing to you?" And I said, well, she didn't understand the borrowing or whatever. And she said, no, she deliberately wanted you to come over and spend time with her personally, showing her how to borrow. She knows how to borrow. I said, oh, that never occurred to me. So I was watching out for it. They also were much better than the ninth graders in trying to keep asking me questions and actually getting me to give away how to do the story problem. Okay, so the interaction, the dynamic, teacher-student dynamic is totally different in primary than intermediate and even than elementary. So the tone that the teacher has to set, how are you going to teach? And that involves how you're teaching, that involves your student-teacher, not student-teacher, but teacher-to-student interactions. And to do that, you have to do what? Watch your vocabulary. You have to know your students. And you have to realize their maturity. You have to realize their math skills, and you have to realize their problem areas. Now in high school, I do need to know the problem areas, and I need to know a lot more math problem areas and less personal problem areas, okay? Because they don't have very many math skills anyways. Whereas older students, you're trying to correct the problem areas and sharpen their math skills. Here, what are we doing? We are actually digging the foundation, then pouring it, okay? So you have to realize that. You have to watch your vocabulary, you have to know your students, and the third main idea here in setting the proper tone is you have to train your students. And this is in a lot more detail, it's in a lot more areas than I ever think about with 7th grade math or 9th grade math. Okay, so you have an entirely different perspective. Okay, and that's why I think it's kind of good for me to teach this class, because I can tell you, I don't naturally teach at primary level. So I had to stop and think, and that made me very aware of the differences between primary and elementary and intermediate. So you have to train your students. This goes back to their maturity level. You have to train them in procedures, first of all. You have to train them, what are they supposed to have on their desk? You're going to say, prepare for math class, or something like that. And then they have to know, when you say prepare for math class, they have their pencil, they have their work page or their workbook or whatever materials that they need that you want them to have on their desk. You may want them to already have their math page torn out and on their desk with their pencil. Or you may not want them to tear out their math page, you may want it to stay in their book. Whatever the details change from person to person and level to level. So you have to kind of have the mindset that you're going to be doing everything. So you have to train them in procedures. What do you want them to have when you start math class? So from the very beginning, you're training them to prepare for math, what you want them to do. How do you want them to turn in their homework? You're training them in procedure. Are you going to walk around and collect it and waste 10 minutes? Are you going to have them turn it in at the beginning of the day? Are you going to have them turn it in at the beginning of the class? All of these things have to be trained. You can't just expect them. They're not 7th graders. They're not 4th graders. You can't just put the problem on the board and have them do it. You can't just put the homework on the board. You have to train them to put it in their assignment pad or wherever you're communicating with their parents, because you have to go through the parents. The parents have to know what their homework is. First grader going to go home and do their homework. Is a first grader going to know what they're supposed to do for their homework? Not necessarily. That's why we require the parents to communicate with the teacher through what we call the assignment pad. And that's why the parent has to sign it, so the parent knows what they have to do. Do first graders need homework? Sure they do. Because especially in math skills have to be practiced. And if you don't assign homework and they do all their work in class, they're not going to have enough practice. They're not going to get their foundation poured the way it needs to be. So you have to watch your vocabulary, you have to know your students, you have to train your students. First of all, you have to train them in procedure, everything you want them to do. Secondly, you have to train them for drill. All right, what happens? I think I've told you this before. I'm doing the flashcards. I drop the flashcards because flashing flashcards can be awkward when you're not used to flashing flashcards. Okay? And what happens when I drop the flashcards in second grade math? They mob me. They all have to get out of their seats and hand them to me. Well, they have to know that they don't get out of their seat. Also, they're all standing and we're playing a competition with the flashcards. And before I know it, they're all up to the front of the room. You have to train them to stand at their seat, stand up, put their hands down. You have to train them in what you want them to do, especially during drill. So by procedure, I'm not just talking about classroom procedure. I'm not just talking about math problem procedure. I'm talking about everything, particularly during drill time. And you train them in it so that they know what the drill is and what they're supposed to do. A lot of times with drill, you're going to have a recitation part where they stand up and they say the one family or whatever, or they stand up and you go through your chart of measurement facts or whatever you're doing, and they have to know what you expect. Here's the key. They have to know what you expect of them during drill time. And then you have to keep tabs on drill time because it can become chaos. But there's a balance. We want it to be fun. We want the games to be fun. We want math class to be active. We want them to be interested and engaged, but we have to train them in what you expect. So when it's time to recite and drill off of our chart, you have to tell them what to do. Stand, sit. If you want to play a game, you have to tell them exactly where they're supposed to stand and sit, when they're supposed to call out the answer, when they're supposed to raise their hand. So this is essential for an orderly classroom. Okay, now this time of year, we're already into February. The first graders and the second graders have been in math class for several months now, and they should be pretty much used to routine. So you have to train them in procedures, and you have to train them in routine, especially with respect to drill. So think about training. They have to know what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and what you expect of them. So you have to watch your vocabulary, you have to know your students, and you have to train your students so that you can, we haven't even got to math, have we? Okay, and all of this is key at the beginning of the year and even the beginning of the class. It's going to take time, but the time that you lose at the beginning of the year will be made up as you're able to accomplish more and more because your students know what you expect of them. They know how to do what you want them to do. You can't expect them to do something you haven't trained them to do. You can't expect them to turn in their homework if you haven't established a routine for turning in their homework. You can't expect them to do the right assignment on their homework if you haven't trained them in a routine. Do you understand what I mean by that? So that's primary. And as far as you teaching a lesson where you're going to have to actually train them a little bit is during your drill time. So the whole tone of primary class is different than middle elementary grades, like Mrs. Hady's class and Mrs. Bishop's class, certainly different than intermediate by the time you start getting to me and Mrs. Dameron, okay? And so you have to have the tone that you know where they are maturity-wise, not just where they are math skills-wise. And you have to train them, okay? And the last thing that you have to do is you have to keep it organized and moving. I don't have to do that in 9th grade. I am doing teaching, the students are getting some practice, I'm not worried about their behavior so much. I'm keeping them too busy. They don't have time to cause me behavior issues. But with the first graders and things, you have to keep it organized and moving. First of all, in routines, you have to have the routines organized. Okay? And then the second thing you have to have is you have to have the drill organized and moving. Everything's moving, clicking along, moving along. So they're beginning routines. What they do when they get to class is what I mean. Then the drill has to be organized and moving. Then the lesson time has to be organized and moving, and even varied. And then the practice time, whether it's seat work, board work, or whatever, has to be organized and moving and even varied. The teacher has to do a lot more work. And this is all accomplished by preparation. So the first thing about preparing to teach your primary lesson is that you have to set the right tone between teacher and student. You have to be aware of your vocabulary, right? You have to know your students. You have to train your students, and then you have to keep everything moving, organized, varied. You have to do it all. And you have to plan it down to the least detail. So that brings us to the next point, planning your class time. Not just your lesson, planning your class time. So you have to understand, you have to set the right tone, and you have to understand what you're facing and what's going to happen in that classroom. Then you have to prepare your class time, not just the lesson itself. And so what Miss Mayville and Mrs. Brader will be looking for when they grade you, what's it going to be? How well you handled the entire class time, not just taught the lesson. So you're going to have to plan everything. Okay, so that's the first idea. Plan every minute, every problem. So plan everything. Every minute, every problem. So this is different at primary level. You have to plan a lot more detail. You have to plan your class, not just your lesson. So you have to plan in detail every minute and every problem, not just every problem, every minute and every problem. You see the difference? When you're teaching 6th grade math, do you have to focus in on what you're doing every minute? No, you're going to focus on the content and make sure the content is clear and make sure your problems are clear, but you have to do a little more to prepare for primary. You have to plan every minute. Okay, so let's talk about that. Planning every minute. To plan every minute includes two things: what you want the students to do and what you are doing. So that's what I mean by when you go into class, and it would be extremely beneficial for you to observe Miss Mayville before you teach for her. And you can count it towards this class, can't you? It would be extremely helpful for you to observe Mrs. Brader before you teach for her, and you can mimic what she does. You kind of need to do that anyways so that you're not throwing the students for a loop when you come in there. We want to have as little disruption as possible. We want you to be Mrs. Brader that day. We want you to be Miss Mayville that day as much as possible. Okay, then when you're your own teacher, and even when you do your student teaching and it's you every day, you can kind of not do your own thing, but you can kind of vary how you do things. But you're going to want to model yourself after the teacher that's there. That's why this class is a practical class. All right, so you've got to plan every minute, and that includes both what you want them to do, not just what you're doing. Okay? Of course you're going to plan what you're doing, but you have to take it a little bit further and plan. Okay, you're going to say, Miss Mayville will probably say, prepare for math class, and she already has them trained. Or what does she say?
First and second graders get ready for break-offs. First graders get ready for break-offs. Second graders get ready for math.
Yes, so the first graders are actually leaving the room and going to a different classroom, because we do the combined first and second grade for main things, but then for English and math and more specific leveled things, they are split. All right, so you're going to have to, your students should already have them prepared for you, and then you're going to have to go up there. So you'll probably be in there getting your stuff set up while the first grade is still in there and they're lining up to leave the room, okay? So you have to plan, what are you going to do? How are you going to start? You can't just say, let's do flashcards. The students are going to wonder what to do. You're going to have to tell them, stand. You might tell them to stay seated. You might say, stand behind your chair. You might say, stand, push in your chair. Stand beside your chair. Or you might say, just pop up and stand. Whatever you want them to do, you just tell them what you want them to do. And you might want to just keep the same pattern that Ms. Mabel or Mrs. Brader always uses, so that you're not promoting chaos. So you have to plan every minute what you're doing, of course, but also what you want them to do, because you have to tell them. Okay, you might tell them to put their math paper aside. Or you're already starting into the lesson and you want them to look at the math page. They just aren't going to do it. You have to tell them, okay, get your math page, pick up your pencil, look at, put your pencil on number 1. Okay, I've even seen teachers do that, first grade. You have to direct their attention. You have to tell them when to pick up their pencil. You have to tell them when to put their pencil down. And when you're actually teaching and you want their full attention, what do you tell them? Put your pencils down, fold your hands. You might have them do a problem, and then you want their attention back. So you have to plan what you're doing. Not just what you're doing, you have to plan what you want the students to do. So you will plan every minute in detail what you want the students to do, and then what you're going to do. The second thing that you will plan is you will plan the lesson. You'll plan every problem. You'll be required to do some board work. Put problems up on the board that you will use in a minute, and you want them already up on the board ready to go. Okay? Or you can use a visual. So you already have your problem written neatly on the visual, and you can just put the visual on the board with magnets. Or you come in before class and you write your problem nice and big, nice and neat, in proper number formation. You can't make 2s like this, can you? You've got to make the 2 the way they make 2s. Okay? Or at least close. So you have to plan your lesson. You have to plan every problem. So underneath this, you're going to plan what you're going to say. You're going to plan what you're going to show, and you're going to plan what you're going to do, problem by problem. If you like, you can even script the class time. What do I mean by script? I mean, you write out what you're going to say, especially at the beginning. And then you'll be extra prepared. Even if you don't use it exactly, you can even write down, find out the students' names so you know who to call on instead of you, or you know their last name because you know their family, but you don't remember which student they are. Okay? I think both Ben and Archie Parrish are in there. Ben's in first grade and Archie's in second grade. So you have to know that's Ben. Okay? You may recognize some of the other students, but you may not know their name. So you need to find out ahead of time what the students are. And then you're going to want to, when you're planning your drill, say, okay, I'm teaching second grade. I'm going to ask Archie this. I'm going to ask, who else is in there? There's a Rose boy, Josiah Rose. I'm going to ask Josiah this. Mitchell girl's in there. Claire? Not Kate, so it's Kate. So that's Claire, that's not Kate, call her by her name. And all those things are going to show that you prepared for your class and that you're ready to go. So all those things are part of planning both every minute and every problem. So a lot of preparation. You're going to want to get with Miss Vayville. You're going to want to, I guess the phrase is pick her brain, right? And same thing with Mrs. Brader. And they know that you're going to be actually doing your student teaching, some of you next year, some of you the following year, and they know that they're helping you prepare to be their student teacher, some of you, okay? So, or they're preparing you to be somebody's student teacher. So all of this is a practical way that I can tell you all day about teaching primary math. Until you do it, you don't know what it's like, okay? So let's learn from Mrs. Wright's mistakes, not make our own mistakes, all right? And so you have to plan every minute, every problem. And so what I want you to be doing is getting with those teachers and finding out some of the things what you will be doing. They may not be able to tell you which lesson, but maybe you can at least get with them and tell them about when you want to do, and they can give you an idea. And then, because I would like to help you actually do this, okay? Plan it. And if you're teaching a brand new concept, you're going to want to figure out exactly how you're going to reach their understanding. So you have to plan not just the lesson, you have to plan the actual class time. You're going to plan the drill in detail. The biggest problem first semester with the lessons that you did, not nearly enough detail. It was too much of an outline. This cannot just be an outline. It has to be thinking through. The more you write, the more comfortable you be when you're actually in front of the class and when you're being graded for it and so forth. Also, you'll notice as you look through the syllabus that there's some drill practicing, drill procedure, and so forth, where we're going to practice doing some of these things with each other, because it takes practice, it takes thought, it takes preparation, and actually I think it takes more preparation, more practice, more thought at primary level than it ever did for me at junior high and high school level, okay, planning the lesson. I was concentrating on content. What do you have to concentrate on? Presentation, right? How are you going to get this across? Yes, I know you know how to borrow, or you know how to tell time, right? Or you know how to convert measurements, or you know how to carry, and you know your times tables, or you know how to multiply. That's not the question. It's how are you going to teach it? How are you going to get it across? I had a big problem in second grade math teaching them to divide things into equal parts. Because second grade math, I was preparing them. I was pouring their foundation for their fraction math. So I had to teach them what a fraction was. And that took a lot of thought. How am I going to present that? How am I going to reach their understanding? So primary math requires a lot of thought, a lot of planning, and a lot of preparation. If you don't do that, your lesson's going to not go off well at all, and the students will not understand it, especially if you're doing a new concept. Though I would imagine Mrs. Brader and Miss Mayville are going to pick a specific type of lesson, an easier type of lesson for you to teach, since it'll be your first time through. But when you do your student teaching, guess what? You are their math teacher for 2 months or 3 months. All right, so it works very well. It's good for you. Sometimes it's not so good for our academy students. You're practicing on them, okay? So that means you have to prepare, because they will have you for, like I said, their math teacher for 2 months, 3 months. Okay, so it's a big responsibility. So you're talking about you have to set the tone. There's a big difference between the students and the student-teacher interaction between primary and intermediate. When we do the intermediate lesson workshop and lesson prep, am I going to be talking like this? No. We're not going to be worried about so much of teacher-student interaction. only a little bit. We're going to be concentrating on the lesson. We're going to be concentrating on what problems should we do. We're going to be concentrating on what procedures does this problem need. We're going to be concentrating on making up problems that teach certain aspects. Does that happen in primary? No, you're going to have to center in on how am I going to get this one thing across? How am I going to reach their understanding? How am I going to get them to carry? How am I going to get them to tell time? From what? Scratch. Okay? So the whole mindset of your lesson preparation has to be extremely detailed and thought out. Not just how you're going to teach every problem you're going to teach. I'm going to review this. I'm going to teach this. Okay, you're going to have to plan. How are you going to show them that problem? How are you going to do that problem? What manipulative can you bring to reach their understanding? So primary math lesson preparation is an entirely different ball game than intermediate. Okay? Because what are we doing? We're starting from scratch. What are we doing? We're digging and pouring their foundation. Do you see how important that is? Everybody knows the song, "The wise man built his house upon the rock. The foolish man built his house on the sand." You all know what happens when the foundation is cracked or flawed to the building. It's what happens to the math skills when there is no foundation. Think about over in third world countries and in tropical regions. Have you ever seen the houses that are built on the little sticks because of the flooding and stuff? I don't think I'd want to live there. All right. Okay, so primary math lesson preparation.